A woman steps onto a plane, a first-class ticket in her hand, a right she paid for, but within seconds, she's told she doesn't belong. Not because of a mistake, not because of an overbooked flight, but because someone decided she shouldn't be there. What starts as an ordinary flight turns into a public humiliation, a brutal abuse of power, and the kind of injustice that has gone unchecked for far too long. She could walk away. She could let it go. But she won't. Because before this flight lands, careers will crumble, truths will be exposed, and the real question will no longer be whether she belongs here, but whether they do. How far will this go? How deep does the corruption run? And when justice comes, will it be enough? What would you have done in her place? Where are you watching from? Comment below and let's talk about it. If you're ready for a story of power, injustice, and the moment it all turns, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Would you believe that a first-class ticket could shatter a person's entire existence? The overhead speakers crackled as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. Ayanna Sinclair adjusted the strap of her leather tote bag and took a deep breath. She'd flown countless times before, business class, first class, private jets, but today felt different. Today, she was flying alone. No assistance. No security. No family name to announce her arrival. Just Ayanna, a woman with a ticket in her pocket and the simple desire to get home. Stepping onto the plane, she barely had time to register the shift in atmosphere before a voice cut through her thoughts. "Miss, I think you're in the wrong place." Ayanna lifted her gaze to see a flight attendant blocking her path. The woman's name tag read Rebecca Albright. Her uniform was crisp, her posture stiff. But it was her expression that stood out, the tight-lipped smirk, the barely concealed sneer as her eyes scanned Ayanna from head to toe. Ayanna offered a polite smile and held out her boarding pass. "I'm in 2A. Rebecca's lips curled upward, the smirk deepening. "First class is for premium passengers, ma'am. Are you sure you didn't mix up your seat assignment?" A few nearby passengers turned to watch. A murmur passed between a well-dressed couple sipping champagne. From the corner of her eye, Ayanna saw a man in a tailored suit raise an eyebrow before returning to his phone. She inhaled sharply but kept her voice even. "There's no mistake. 2A, first class." Rebecca let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "I see this all the time. People assume they belong somewhere they don't." Ayanna's fingers tightened around the boarding pass. "Check the ticket." Rebecca didn't move. Instead, she crossed her arms, shifting her weight to one side. "We have a full cabin today. I suggest you find your actual seat before we have to call security." The words landed heavier than expected, like a stone sinking into her stomach. Ayanna felt a prickle of heat rise up her spine. She had been here before, not here, on an airplane, but in moments just like this. Moments where people looked at her and decided she didn't belong. A chuckle came from one of the passengers. A businessman with salt and pepper hair leaned toward his seatmate and murmured, "She's just trying to climb a little too high." Laughter followed. Ayanna set her jaw and exhaled through her nose. "Not today." Slowly, she unfolded her ticket, making sure Rebecca had a clear view. "You can scan it if you'd like," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "It's valid." For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Rebecca's face. Doubt. No. Annoyance. She snatched the ticket, glancing at it with little interest before thrusting it back at Ayanna. "There's obviously a mistake," she said briskly. "You need to step aside while we sort this out." Ayanna held her ground. "I'm not moving." The tension between them thickened. Rebecca's fingers twitched at her side, her professional mask slipping. "Security," she called over her shoulder, her voice sharp, commanding. "We have a situation at boarding." Ayanna's stomach twisted. A uniformed officer approached, his steps heavy against the carpeted floor. "What's going on?" Rebecca wasted no time. "This passenger refuses to comply. She's trying to access first class without the proper credentials." Ayanna scoffed.
"Proper credencials."
"It's a boarding pass, not a top-secret clearance." The officer hesitated, glancing between Ayanna and Rebecca. Ma'am, do you have your identification? Ayana reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the cool leather of her wallet. This was ridiculous. Humiliating. She had every right to be here, and yet, she was being treated like an intruder. Before she could produce her ID, Rebecca's voice cut through again. You know what? Enough, she snapped. And then, before anyone could stop her, she reached forward, snatched the ticket from Ayana's hands, and tore it in half. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Ayana froze, heart hammering in her chest. Rebecca smiled, holding up the two halves. Looks like you really don't have a seat now. The businessman who had laughed earlier let out a satisfied hum. The other passengers remained silent, their faces a mix of discomfort and quiet approval. Ayana felt something hot coil in her chest. Not just anger, but something deeper. A wound being reopened, a memory resurfacing. The years of being doubted, questioned, diminished. She wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't going to let this slide. A muscle in her jaw tensed as she met Rebecca's gaze head-on. You just made a mistake, she said, her voice steady. Rebecca smirked. Oh, I don't think so. But she had. A mistake that would cost her everything. How far could a person go to make someone feel small? Ayana's breath was steady, but her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. The torn halves of her boarding pass drifted to the floor, landing at her feet like discarded scraps of dignity. For a moment, silence hung in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, a quiet chuckle broke the stillness. That settles it, Rebecca said, dusting her hands together as if she had just finished a trivial task. Now, let's not make this any harder than it needs to be. Ayana clenched her jaw. I paid for that seat. Rebecca tilted her head, feigning concern. Oh, then where's your ticket? Heat surged through Ayana's chest. She forced herself to take a slow breath. Losing control wouldn't help. She had to be smart about this. I need to speak to a supervisor. Rebecca scoffed. A supervisor? She turned toward the galley and called out, Kara, could you come here for a second? A younger flight attendant appeared, her expression hesitant. Kara's gaze flickered from Rebecca to Ayana, then to the torn ticket on the ground. For a split second, there was something in her eyes, uncertainty, maybe even guilt, but it disappeared when Rebecca shot her a sharp look. Rebecca's voice dropped to an almost patronizing tone. Would you mind confirming for our guest here that without a valid boarding pass, she cannot sit in first class? Kara hesitated. Ayana saw the slight shift in her stance, the way her hands fidgeted at her sides. She knows this isn't right. But then Kara nodded. I'm sorry, ma'am. Airline policy requires a valid ticket. Ayana exhaled slowly. That's my seat. Rebecca crossed her arms. And yet, you have no proof of that. From the first-class cabin, a few passengers murmured amongst themselves. Someone let out an amused snort. A man in a navy blue suit smirked. I knew it. Thought she could just walk in here and pretend to belong. Ayana turned her head sharply. The man wore a Rolex, his posture relaxed as if he were watching a particularly entertaining show. His seatmate, a blonde woman wrapped in a cashmere shawl, chuckled under her breath. Rebecca's smirk deepened. Security is already on the way. Ayana's fingers twitched. The urge to snap back, to fight, burned in her throat. But she knew how this would look. A black woman raising her voice, standing her ground, refusing to obey. She could already see the headlines in her mind. So she did the one thing she knew would unnerve them all. She smiled. Good, she said, lifting her chin. Let's have a real authority figure handle this. Rebecca's expression flickered, just for a second. She had expected Ayana to lash out, to break down. Instead, Ayana stood taller, her confidence unwavering. A pair of uniformed security officers approached. One of them, a bald man with sharp eyes, stepped forward. Ma'am, we've been informed that you are attempting to sit in a section that is not assigned to you. Ayana nodded once. That's incorrect. My assigned seat is 2A. This flight attendant took my boarding pass and destroyed it. The officer turned to Rebecca. Is this true? Rebecca let out a dramatic sigh. Officer, she came in here without a proper ticket. We cannot verify her seat assignment. And since she refuses to move, I refuse to be unjustly removed, Ayanna corrected. Rebecca rolled her eyes. We had no choice but to call you in. The second officer, a younger man, frowned slightly. Do you have an ID, ma'am? Ayanna nodded and reached for her wallet. But as soon as she started pulling it out, the older officer's hand hovered near his belt. A subtle movement, but one Ayanna didn't miss. A warning. The implication was clear. Any sudden move, any wrong move, could escalate the situation. Slowly, she presented her ID. The officer examined it. His brows furrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Rebecca, impatient, tapped her foot. Look, this is ridiculous. She doesn't have a boarding pass. If she really belonged here, she wouldn't be causing this much trouble. The Rolex-wearing man let out a snicker. Exactly. People who belong don't have to fight this hard to prove it. A fresh wave of humiliation crashed over Ayanna. She had never felt smaller. The younger officer turned to Rebecca. Where's the passenger manifest? We can verify her name. Rebecca hesitated. Well, Unless, the officer said, narrowing his eyes, you never actually checked it. A flash of irritation crossed Rebecca's face, but before she could respond, the man in the Rolex laughed again. Oh, come on. We all know what this is. He gestured at Ayanna. She thought she could play pretend, maybe get a free upgrade. And now she's throwing a fit because she got caught. Ayanna's nails dug into her palm. Rebecca, emboldened, smirked. That's exactly what I was saying. The officer sighed. Ma'am, if you don't leave this section, we will have to physically remove you. Ayanna swallowed hard. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. If she resisted, they would make an example of her. If she complied, she would be walking away defeated. Either way, she lost. Rebecca leaned in, lowering her voice so only Ayanna could hear. You're embarrassing yourself. This should be a lesson for you. Know your place. Ayanna met her gaze, unwavering. You just made another mistake. Rebecca chuckled. And what's that? Ayanna's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. You think I'm alone? How much humiliation can a person endure before they finally break? The first-class cabin had settled into an uneasy silence, but the tension was razor-sharp, hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. The security officers stood at Ayanna's sides now, their presence heavy, authoritative. Rebecca folded her arms, smug and triumphant. Let's go. You're holding up the flight. Ayanna remained still. Her heart pounded, but she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. The younger officer sighed, his voice softer than the older one's. Ma'am, please. If you come with us, we can sort this out at the gate. A distraction. A trap. The moment she stepped off this plane, she knew exactly what would happen. She'd be banned from the flight, labeled as uncooperative, and forced to take the next plane if they even let her fly at all. No, her voice was calm, unwavering. Rebecca's jaw tensed. The passengers were watching, some entertained, others clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere. The businessman in the Rolex chuckled under his breath. What's the endgame here? You really think if you make a scene, they're gonna let you stay? Ayanna turned her head, meeting his amused gaze. I think people like you have spent their whole lives making sure people like me never get to sit here. The smile twitched off his face, just slightly. Rebecca exhaled sharply. Enough of this. Officer, please. The older guard didn't wait. His grip closed around Ayanna's arm, firm and unyielding. Let's go. Something in Ayanna snapped. She jerked her arm back, twisting slightly, an instinctive reaction to the unwarranted force. The movement startled him. His grip tightened. And then it happened. A hard shove. Unintentional, perhaps, but strong enough. Her balance faltered. A sharp gasp rippled through the cabin as Ayanna stumbled backward and hit the floor. For a moment, everything was still. Then the laughter came. It started with the businessman, a short, mocking chuckle. A few others followed, soft murmurs, a couple of amused smiles. Someone muttered, "Guess she finally found her place." Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. The security officers didn't apologize. The older one barely spared her a glance before shifting his stance, waiting for her to get up. Rebecca, meanwhile, looked down at her with a smirk. "You should have just listened the first time." Ayanna pressed her palms against the floor, steadying herself. The humiliation burned hot in her chest, crawling up her throat like bile. Not because she had fallen, not because they were laughing, because no one, not a single person, had done anything. She scanned the cabin, searching for anyone who would meet her gaze. Some looked away, avoiding the moment entirely. Others watched with quiet interest, the way people do when they see a car accident on the side of the road. But none of them spoke. None of them helped. Slowly, deliberately, Ayanna pushed herself to her feet. Her breathing was even, but her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed out her dress. Rebecca shook her head. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Ayanna didn't respond. She only lifted her chin. Rebecca turned to security. "Get her out of here." The older officer reached for her again. And then, a voice. Low, controlled, but filled with unmistakable authority. "What the hell is going on here?" The air shifted. Heads turned. Passengers straightened in their seats. Even Rebecca's posture stiffened slightly before she turned toward the source of the voice. A man stood at the entrance of the first-class cabin. Tall, impeccably dressed, exuding the kind of presence that demanded attention. His sharp, dark eyes swept over the scene in an instant, taking in Ayanna, the security officers, the torn ticket on the ground. His expression darkened. Ayanna's pulse quickened. She knew that voice. Rebecca blinked, clearly thrown off by the sudden interruption. "Sir, there was an issue with seating." This woman. He didn't even let her finish. His gaze locked onto Ayanna. "Are you all right?" Ayanna swallowed hard, trying to suppress the storm raging inside her. "I'm fine." He didn't look convinced. Rebecca stepped forward, regaining some of her composure. "Sir, this is a private matter." The man turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Rebecca's. She paled, because now she recognized him too. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone whispered his name under their breath, barely audible, but enough to send a shockwave through the space. Rebecca's throat bobbed. "I." But the man ignored her. Instead, he turned to the officers, his voice even, but carrying the weight of undeniable authority. "Why is my daughter being harassed on this flight?" A stunned silence fell over the cabin. The businessman's smirk vanished. The blonde woman clutched her purse a little tighter. Even the younger security officer looked like he wanted to disappear. Rebecca. Rebecca looked like she had just been sentenced to death. The older officer's mouth opened, then closed. He blinked once, twice, then cleared his throat. "Sir, I wasn't aware." The man, Thomas Sinclair, didn't move, but the sheer force of his presence made the officer shrink back. "No, you weren't." His voice was deadly calm. "Because if you were, none of this would have happened." Ayanna's chest tightened. For the first time since this entire ordeal started, since she had been questioned, humiliated, mocked, she saw it. Fear. Not in her. In them. Rebecca took an unsteady step back, her lips parting like she wanted to explain, to make some desperate excuse. But it was too late. Far, far too late. What is more dangerous, a blatant lie or the silence that allows it to thrive? Ayanna stood still, her shoulders squared, her breath measured. But inside, she was burning. The cabin of first class had become something else entirely. No longer a place of comfort, of luxury. It had turned into an arena, where she stood alone against an unspoken but undeniable force. She could feel the weight of 100 silent judgments pressing down on her, crushing, suffocating. Rebecca, standing just a few feet away, was the embodiment of that force. "Enough games," the flight attendant said, her voice sharp, cutting. "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, but you're only embarrassing yourself." She gestured toward security. "Remove her from the plane." Ayana's pulse throbbed in her ears. "Not like this. Not when I'm right. I want my name checked on the passenger manifest," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "That will settle everything." For the first time, there was a flicker of hesitation in Rebecca's eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by something colder, more calculated. "I already checked," Rebecca said smoothly. "Your name wasn't there." A blatant lie, delivered so effortlessly, so confidently, that anyone who didn't know better might have believed it. But Ayana knew better. A knot formed in her stomach, not just from anger, but from the realization of just how dangerous Rebecca was. Not because she was screaming, or being overtly aggressive. No, because she didn't have to. Rebecca had already won over the audience. She didn't need force, she had doubt. She had compliance. She had silence. What is worse than being wronged? Being unable to prove it. Ayana felt the moment slipping away from her. The walls of the first-class cabin seemed to close in, the air growing thick with an unspoken finality. No matter what she said, no matter how logical her arguments were, the people around her had already made up their minds. She wasn't fighting for a seat anymore. She was fighting against something much larger. Rebecca exhaled, shaking her head like she was dealing with a stubborn child. "I'm getting tired of repeating myself," she said, voice laced with false patience. She turned to security. "She has no valid boarding pass. Remove her." Ayana clenched her fists. "I do have a valid ticket," she said. "You destroyed it." Rebecca raised a perfectly arched brow. "Did I?" Ayana's pulse pounded. She turned to the younger security officer, the one who had seemed hesitant before. "You saw her tear it up," she insisted. "That's evidence of tampering." The officer hesitated. He had seen it, but hesitation wasn't the same as intervention. Rebecca, sensing the moment of doubt, acted swiftly. She let out a light laugh, just enough to make the idea seem absurd. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "If I really tore up a valid first-class ticket, don't you think there would be a record of her name?" Ayana latched onto that. "Then check." For the second time, the demand for proof hung in the air. Daniel, the senior flight attendant, folded his arms. "It would take 30 seconds to verify the manifest," he said, his voice calm but pointed. For a fraction of a second, Rebecca's eyes flickered toward the galley, toward the service tablet where Kara had pulled up the passenger list earlier. Ayana saw it. Daniel saw it. Rebecca saw that they saw it. And that was when she made her move. With an air of forced exasperation, Rebecca turned to Kara. "Fine. Since they insist, bring me the manifest." Kara blinked, caught off guard. Ayana's heart pounded. Finally, they would have the proof. Kara hurried toward the galley, tapping rapidly on the screen. The tablet beeped softly as she accessed the system. A few tense seconds passed. Then, her eyes widened slightly. She had found it. Ayana's name was there. Rebecca's body tensed. And then, so quick that most of the passengers didn't even notice, she moved. A single step. A smooth motion. By the time Kara turned around, tablet in hand, Rebecca had already reached her. And before anyone could react, she yanked it out of Kara's grip. The cabin gasped as Kara let out a startled sound, nearly stumbling back. Rebecca's fingers flew over the screen, her body half turned to block the passengers from seeing what she was doing. "No!" Kara tried to protest, but Rebecca shut her down instantly. "That's enough, Kara," she snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. Ayana took a step forward, realization hitting her like a freight train. "You're tampering with it," she said, her voice shaking with rage. Rebecca ignored her. She tapped a few more times, then turned the screen off and hugged the tablet against her chest. "Nothing there," she announced breezily. "As I said." Ayana's blood ran cold. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I just double-checked," Rebecca interrupted smoothly. And her name isn't there. Now, can we finally put an end to this? Kara's lips parted like she wanted to object. But then, Rebecca shot her a look. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream. But it was a threat. Kara shrank back, her hands trembling slightly. Ayanna felt something shatter inside her. This wasn't just cheating. This wasn't just unfair. This was obliteration. Rebecca had just erased her from the system. And now, there was nothing left to prove that she had ever belonged here. The older security officer grunted. That settles it. He stepped toward Ayanna again. Ayanna's nails dug into her palms. She turned desperately to Daniel. You saw what she just did. Daniel hesitated. For the first time, something like frustration flickered across his face. He had seen it. He knew. But knowing and acting were two different things. His lips parted, like he wanted to say something. But before he could, Rebecca delivered the final blow. This isn't your call, Daniel. It was a warning. It wasn't just about this flight. It was about his job, his career. Daniel's jaw tightened. And then, slowly, he stepped back. Ayanna felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. She turned again, toward the passengers, toward anyone. You all saw it, she said. You know what she just did. Silence. Some of them looked away. Others stared blankly, unwilling to get involved. The businessman in the Rolex scoffed. Lady, just let it go. Rebecca exhaled dramatically. I have been more than patient, she said. I have tried to handle this politely. But we are done here. She turned to security. Escort her off the plane. Now. The older officer nodded, stepping forward with purpose this time. The younger officer still looked conflicted, but he didn't object. Because no one objected. A wave of pure, numbing hopelessness washed over Ayanna. Rebecca had done it. She had stolen her voice. She had stolen her proof. She had stolen her right to fight back. Ayanna had nothing left. Nothing but the bitter taste of injustice in her mouth. Rebecca smiled, tilting her head slightly. Let this be a lesson, she murmured. Then, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. This is what happens when people forget their place. Ayanna swallowed the burn rising in her throat. She had lost. For now. Ayanna scanned the cabin. She caught the eyes of a few passengers, searching for something. Sympathy, support, anything. But most of them looked away. Others stared with a quiet, detached curiosity, as if she were a spectacle rather than a person. And then there were the ones who enjoyed this. The businessman with the Rolex let out a dramatic sigh, shifting in his seat. Jesus, can we just get on with this? Some of us have real problems to deal with. A few chuckles followed. Rebecca smirked. Exactly. This is a waste of time. Ayanna clenched her fists. Daniel, the senior flight attendant, had been watching the exchange carefully. He shifted slightly, his expression unreadable. You checked already? He asked, voice mild but probing. Rebecca nodded firmly. Yes. There's no need to waste time. But she had hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. And Ayanna saw it. She never checked at all. Kara, the younger flight attendant, stood by the galley, her hands fidgeting slightly at her sides. Ayanna caught her gaze. Just for a moment. There was something there. Hesitation. Guilt. Kara knew the truth. Ayanna's heart pounded. If Kara spoke up, if she confirmed that the manifest hadn't actually been checked, it could shift everything. The younger woman licked her lips, glancing nervously between Ayanna and Rebecca. Then, finally, I can check again, Kara offered hesitantly. It wouldn't take long. Silence. Then, Rebecca turned to her so quickly that Kara physically flinched. No. The single word was sharp. Final. Kara's fingers twitched. She swallowed hard, her posture stiffening. Rebecca took a step closer to her, lowering her voice just enough so that no one but Kara could hear. You're already on probation, she murmured. Do you really want to test me right now? Ayanna's stomach twisted as she watched Kara's entire body tense. A long, suffocating pause. Then, slowly, Kara shook her head. "No, ma'am." Ayana inhaled sharply. "Damn it." Rebecca turned back toward security, satisfaction radiating off of her. "You heard her. This discussion is over." The older officer nodded, stepping forward. "Ma'am, you need to come with us now." Ayana's heart pounded against her ribs. The younger officer hesitated, his brow furrowed slightly. He wasn't fully convinced. He had seen Rebecca's hesitation. He had heard Kara's uncertainty. But he didn't stop his partner either. Rebecca folded her arms, smiling. The businessman in the Rolex let out an exaggerated sigh. Finally, Ayana felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It wasn't even just about her. It was about all the times this had happened before. To her, to others, to people who weren't rich enough, who weren't connected enough, who weren't born with the right privilege to be treated like they belonged. The laughter, the dismissal, the quiet approval of everyone who knew this was wrong but chose to stay silent. Rebecca had won this round, and she knew it. Rebecca exhaled dramatically. "This is the problem, you know," she said, shaking her head as if she were disappointed in Ayana. "You people never know when to stop pushing." Something in Ayana's chest twisted painfully. The cabin had gone deathly silent. Even the passengers who had been chuckling moments before seemed to realize that Rebecca had just crossed an invisible line. But no one said a word. Not Daniel. Not Kara. Not the security officers. Not a single person. What does it feel like to lose everything? Ayana had never known true silence until this moment. Not the kind of silence that came from peace or serenity, but the kind that smothered, that choked. The kind of silence that was filled with knowing. Everyone here knew. They knew what had just happened. They knew what Rebecca had done. They knew Ayana was right. And they had all chosen to say nothing. She saw it in their faces. Some watched with interest, others with mild discomfort. Some enjoyed the spectacle. The businessman in the Rolex looked bored. The blonde woman next to him sipped her champagne like this was beneath her concern. Rebecca, meanwhile, was smiling. Not a wide grin. No, something smaller. Smug. Satisfied. She had won. The older security officer grunted, stepping forward with purpose this time. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now." Ayana's chest tightened. "Don't do this," she said, her voice raw. "You know this isn't right." The officer didn't flinch. "I don't make the rules. You're enforcing them," she shot back. No response. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his hesitation lingering. But not enough to stop what was happening. Because that was how injustice worked. Some enforced it. Most just allowed it. Ayana looked to Daniel, the senior flight attendant, the one who had seemed like he might intervene. But his face had hardened now, resigned. He wouldn't risk his job. He wouldn't risk anything for her. Rebecca let out an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, for God's sake, just take her off the plane already." The older officer grabbed her arm. Ayana yanked it back. "No." The word hung in the air. Rebecca's smile faltered. Ayana wasn't going to make this easy. She wasn't going to go quietly. The officer stepped closer, his hand reaching for her again. Ayana stepped back, jaw tightening. And then, another set of hands grabbed her other arm. The younger officer. No more hesitation. No more doubt. Just action. "Let me go," she snapped, trying to pull free. They didn't. The grip tightened. Hard. Ayana fought, twisting against them. But there were two of them, and only one of her. Someone let out a soft chuckle. Jesus, she's actually resisting. The grip on her arms tightened even more. Too tight. "You're hurting me." Neither officer reacted. They started pulling her toward the exit. Ayana dug her heels into the carpet. Rebecca clicked her tongue. "Just accept it. You lost." The words sliced through her, but Ayana didn't stop moving. She couldn't. Because once they got her past that door, she would be erased. This moment would be forgotten. The humiliation would belong only to her. They pulled harder. Ayana twisted, trying to free herself. And that's when it happened. One of them pushed her forward. Maybe it was too much force. Maybe it was an accident. But the result was the same. She stumbled. Her knee buckled. Her balance gave out. And she fell. Hard. The sound of her body hitting the floor echoed through the cabin. And then, laughter. It started small. A single chuckle. Then another. A ripple. Rebecca let out a soft, amused hum. Rolex man smirked. Guess she finally found her place. A few more chuckles. No gasps. No shock. Just entertainment. Ayana's palms pressed against the carpet, her arms trembling. The pain in her knee barely registered. The humiliation drowned it out. Her breathing was sharp, ragged. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. Not a single hand was extended toward her. Not a single voice had objected. No one had stopped this. Ayana's chest ached. Not just from the fall. From this. From the knowing. They don't care. They never did. She swallowed the burn rising in her throat, her nails digging into the carpet. Rebecca stepped closer, looming over her. "See," she murmured. "This is where you belong." Ayana's fingers curled into fists. Slowly, she pushed herself up. Her knee screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She wouldn't stay down. Not for them. Not for anyone. Rebecca sighed dramatically. "Let's wrap this up. Take her out." The older officer grabbed her arm again, tighter this time. Ayana flinched. They weren't going to stop. They were going to drag her all the way out. Rebecca leaned in slightly, low enough that only Ayana could hear. "You should have known better," she whispered. Ayana turned her head slightly, met her gaze, and smiled. It wasn't a big smile. Not wide, not joyful. But it was enough. Because for the first time, Rebecca hesitated. Just for a second. Just enough. Because she saw it. Ayana wasn't broken. She was waiting. And Rebecca didn't understand why. Not yet. Not yet. The younger officer hesitated again, his grip loosening just slightly. Rebecca snapped. "Move!" And just like that, Ayana was yanked toward the exit. Dragged closer and closer to the door. Almost gone. Almost erased. Almost. What does absolute defeat look like? The air was suffocating. Ayana's pulse pounded in her ears as the officers dragged her toward the exit. The cold grip on her arms tightened, their strength absolute. Her feet barely kept up, her shoes scraping against the carpeted floor. She wasn't walking. She was being removed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her breath sharp and uneven. It wasn't just the pain in her knee, still throbbing from the fall. It wasn't just the humiliation of having been laughed at, dismissed, erased. It was the finality of it all. This was it. She was seconds away from being forced off this plane. And the world wouldn't care. Rebecca followed a few steps behind, watching like a queen overseeing an execution. The smirk on her lips was undeniable now. She had won. And she was enjoying it. "Should have just walked out when you had the chance," she mused, almost playfully. Ayana clenched her jaw, but she didn't respond. Because there was nothing left to say. The exit loomed ahead, bright and open, the last thing standing between her and complete erasure. One step closer. One step closer. And a voice. "Oh, this is going viral." The words were casual, amused. Ayana barely had time to process them before the click of a recording phone sounded from behind her. Her stomach dropped. She turned her head just slightly. A young woman in business attire, sitting comfortably in her first-class seat, was holding up her phone, recording the entire scene. A slow smirk curled on her lips as she angled the camera. "Gotta capture this," the woman chuckled. People love a good airport meltdown. Heat surged through Ayana's chest. This wasn't help. This wasn't exposing the truth. This was entertainment. The people around her weren't just ignoring her suffering. They were capitalizing on it. Another voice, this time a man's, murmured, "Man, this is crazy. Not wrong. Not unfair. Just crazy." Like she was an animal caught in some bizarre spectacle, and they were the audience. Watching, laughing, recording. Her erasure would be a footnote, a 30-second clip on someone's feed, a fleeting amusement before they scrolled past to the next scandal. Rebecca let out an exaggerated sigh. "See," she said, motioning toward the woman recording. "This is why you should have left quietly. Now you just look desperate." Another ripple of laughter. Ayana's stomach churned. Her body ached, her breath uneven. But it wasn't defeat that filled her now. It was something else. Something darker. Something stronger. It didn't matter what she said anymore. It didn't matter how logical or reasonable she was. This wasn't about rules. It was about power. And Rebecca had all of it. Ayana's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her nails biting into her palms. She wanted to fight. She wanted to shove off the guards, to scream at these people, to make them see what they were doing. But she didn't. Because that's what they wanted. That's what Rebecca wanted. A final outburst, something to justify everything they had done to her. She was aggressive. She was being difficult. She was out of control. Ayana could already hear the excuses forming in their minds. So she didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just stared. Directly at Rebecca. Unblinking. Unwavering. Rebecca's smirk faltered. Just slightly. She had expected anger. She had expected pleading. She had expected desperation. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected Ayana to accept the moment without breaking. And for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed her face. Only for a second. Then it was gone. Rebecca rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't look at me like that." She gestured to the officers. "Come on, we're done here." The grip on Ayana's arms tightened again. One step closer. One step closer. She was one breath away from being erased. And then, a shadow crossed the cabin. Heavy footsteps. A presence. Ayana didn't see him at first. She felt him. The shift in the air. The sudden tension in the room. Rebecca noticed it too. Her smirk twitched, just slightly, before she turned toward the front of the plane. And then, a voice. Low. Controlled. But undeniably powerful. "What the hell is going on here?" The room froze. Every head turned. Every breath hitched. Rebecca's body stiffened. Because standing there, at the entrance of the first-class cabin, towering, composed, and absolutely furious, was Thomas Sinclair. What happens when the predator realizes it was never the one in control? The silence in the cabin was absolute. Ayana could feel the shift before she even turned to look. The atmosphere, once filled with sneers, laughter, and quiet amusement, had changed. The tension in the air was now thick, suffocating, and the power dynamic in the room had tilted violently. Because standing at the entrance of the first-class cabin, exuding an unmistakable aura of authority and danger, was Thomas Sinclair. Her father. He wasn't a loud man. He didn't need to be. His presence alone commanded attention. Tall, sharp-featured, dressed in an immaculately tailored black suit, he looked dangerously calm, the kind of calm that preceded a storm. His piercing gaze swept across the scene with unreadable intensity, assessing everything in seconds. The two security officers gripping Ayana's arms. Rebecca standing smugly nearby. The other passengers, some now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. And then, his gaze landed on Ayana. His daughter, being dragged, bruised, humiliated. Something in his expression flickered. Something dark. Then, his voice, low, precise, and deadly controlled. "What the hell is going on here?" The silence deepened. The older security officer, still gripping Ayana's arm, cleared his throat. "Sir, there was a..." Thomas raised a hand. The officer shut up instantly. A second passed. Then another. Nobody spoke. Not because they didn't want to, but because suddenly, Nobody knew what the hell they had just walked into. Except for one person. Rebecca. Her smug expression faltered, just slightly. She was trying to assess the situation, to maintain the upper hand. She failed. Because Thomas Sinclair had just entered the room, and she was no longer in control. Still, she squared her shoulders and forced a polite smile. "Sir, I assure you, this is a minor issue. There was a misunderstanding with seating, and this woman," she motioned to Ayanna dismissively, "was refusing to cooperate." Thomas's eyes didn't leave Ayanna. His jaw clenched ever so slightly. Then, finally, he looked at Rebecca. And for the first time since this entire thing started, Ayanna saw it. Rebecca hesitated. It wasn't much. Just a flicker. A fraction of a second. But it was enough. Because she was beginning to understand. She had messed up. But she didn't know how badly yet. Still, she continued, trying to regain control of the conversation. She didn't have a valid boarding pass, and per airline policy. Thomas's head tilted just slightly. The movement was slow, controlled. Rebecca's words died in her throat. "Is that so?" His voice was like ice, smooth but carrying a weight that sent a ripple of unease through the room. He turned, deliberately, to Daniel, the senior flight attendant. "And you allowed this?" Daniel stiffened. His lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came out. Rebecca saw it. The power dynamic had shifted. It was slipping out of her hands. Fast. Still, she forced a professional smile, doubling down. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but I need to ask you to step aside so we can resolve this." Thomas took one step forward. It was slow, deliberate. Rebecca involuntarily stepped back. His gaze locked onto her. "Do you know who I am?" The question wasn't loud. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was a test. Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it. Something like realization dawned in her eyes. She looked at Ayanna, then back at Thomas, and then, finally, at the passengers whose expressions were beginning to change. The businessman in the Rolex stiffened, his amusement gone. The woman who had been recording shifted uncomfortably. Even the blonde in cashmere, who had seemed utterly unbothered before, was now sitting up straighter. Because now they knew. And so did Rebecca. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just a wealthy man. This wasn't just an upset passenger. This was Thomas Sinclair, billionaire, CEO of Sinclair Global, one of the largest financial empires in the world. A man so powerful that airlines bent over backward to accommodate him. And she had just manhandled his daughter. Ayanna saw the exact moment Rebecca realized she had ruined her entire life. The blood drained from her face. She tried, desperately, to recover. "Sir, I wasn't aware." Thomas cut her off, with just a look. Then, calmly, he turned toward security. "Let her go." The younger officer immediately released Ayanna's arm. The older one hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, before doing the same. Ayanna exhaled sharply, her skin burning where their fingers had been. Thomas's gaze flicked back to Rebecca. "Where's the passenger manifest?" he asked coolly. Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came out. She was still too stunned. Daniel, however, moved instantly. Because he wasn't going down with her. He grabbed the tablet from the galley, tapped a few times, and then, he found it. The confirmation. The proof. He turned the screen toward Thomas. And in clear, undeniable black letters. "Sinclair, Ayanna, Seat 2A. The cabin erupted in whispers. Ayanna saw the color fully drain from Rebecca's face now. Pure. Unfiltered. Horror. She had just thrown the daughter of Thomas Sinclair off a flight. And everyone had seen it. Thomas didn't look at the screen. He didn't need to. His expression remained unreadable. "So," he said, voice dangerously quiet. "You were saying?" Rebecca was frozen. The businessman in the Rolex looked sick. The woman who had been recording turned off her phone. Passengers who had once mocked Ayanna were now completely silent. Because this was no longer her humiliation. This was now Rebecca's. She had been so certain, so powerful, and now she stood on the edge of ruin. Thomas took another step forward, and finally, Rebecca stumbled back. Because now she understood. She wasn't just in trouble. She was done. What is worse than failure? Failure witnessed by the world. The weight of silence in the cabin had never been heavier. Rebecca stood motionless, her face drained of color, her lips parted like she wanted to say something. Anything, but no words came out. Because there were no words that could fix this. She had mocked Ayanna. She had humiliated her. She had physically removed her from a seat that belonged to her. And she had done it all in front of Thomas Sinclair, the most powerful man on this plane. One of the most powerful men in the country. The realization crashed down on her like a tidal wave, drowning her in pure horror. Slowly, Thomas turned to face her fully. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes, sharp and assessing, were the kind that could tear a person apart without ever raising his voice. "You were saying?" His voice was quiet, controlled, lethal. Rebecca's mouth opened. A choked sound escaped. And I had no idea. Thomas raised a hand. The simple motion shut her down instantly. "No," he said coldly. "You don't get to play ignorant now." Rebecca flinched. Ayanna watched, her breath steadying. For the first time since this ordeal began, she wasn't the one on trial anymore. Rebecca was. The entire plane was. Thomas's gaze flickered over to Daniel, the senior flight attendant, then to the two security officers who had manhandled his daughter. Finally, his eyes swept across the passengers, those who had laughed, who had recorded, who had stayed silent. No one met his gaze. Because now they all knew. They had been complicit. Every single one of them. And Thomas Sinclair was not a man who let things slide. Rebecca's breathing was uneven now. "Sir, I swear I was just following protocol." Thomas let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Let's be very clear about what happened here," he said. His voice was still calm. Too calm. "You accused my daughter of lying. You humiliated her in front of an entire cabin of people. You called security on her. You had her physically removed from her seat." Rebecca visibly trembled. She wanted to deny it, to explain. But there was no way out. It was all true. All of it. "And then," Thomas continued, stepping forward slowly, his presence almost suffocating, "when asked to verify the manifest, when given an opportunity to correct your mistake, you tampered with the records to cover your own incompetence." Another sharp inhale from the cabin. The businessman in the Rolex shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The woman who had recorded earlier was now pretending she had never touched her phone. Nobody wanted to be noticed, because nobody wanted to be next. Rebecca's entire body shook. I didn't tamper with." Thomas's voice dropped even lower. "Do not lie to me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a yell. But it was devastating." Rebecca physically recoiled. She was crumbling. "Sir, please," she whispered. It was a misunderstanding." Thomas exhaled slowly. Then, finally, he smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was ice cold. "Let's see if your employer agrees." And just like that, he turned to Daniel. The senior flight attendant visibly tensed. "You," Thomas said. "Call your supervisor. Now." Daniel hesitated. Then he moved. Because nobody refused Thomas Sinclair. He quickly tapped into the communication panel, his hands trembling slightly. The entire cabin watched as he muttered into his headset, requesting the presence of a higher authority. Rebecca's breath came out in panicked gasps. She turned wildly, looking for help, but there was none. The passengers she had felt so powerful in front of? Now they were just watching, unmoving, detached. Rebecca was alone. A few excruciating minutes passed before a new voice crackled over the intercom. "This is Marcus Doyle, head of in-flight operations." "What's the issue?" Thomas didn't wait for Daniel to respond. He stepped closer to the communication panel and, in a voice so calm it was terrifying, said, "The issue is that your employee illegally removed my daughter from her seat, humiliated her in front of an entire plane, and attempted to falsify records to cover it up." Silence. A long, heavy pause. And, "Excuse me." The tension in the cabin was a living thing now, pulsing, crushing. Rebecca was shaking. She knew what was coming. She knew. Thomas waited, let the silence settle, and Rebecca Albright. Rebecca's breath hitched. Hearing him say her name made it real, made it final. Marcus Doyle's voice returned, now sharp, urgent. "Sir, give me one moment." Another minute passed, and Ms. Albright. Rebecca froze. The voice over the intercom was icy. "You are relieved of duty. Effective immediately." The words slammed into her. Her mouth opened. "Wait. Your access to the airline system has been revoked." "No, please. Security will escort you off the aircraft once it lands. You are to remove your uniform before leaving company property." Rebecca stumbled backward. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She turned desperately, her eyes landing on Ayanna. Not with contempt, not with condescension, but with pure, desperate pleading. "Please," she whispered. You don't have to do this." Ayanna stared at her. Everything Rebecca had done, every insult, every humiliation, every ounce of cruelty, came crashing down. And now, she wanted mercy? Ayanna tilted her head slightly. Then, quietly, she said, "I thought I didn't belong here." Rebecca's lips trembled. Ayanna held her gaze for another second. Then she turned away. Rebecca's last hope shattered. A choked sob escaped her throat. Because now she understood. She hadn't just lost her job. She had lost everything. What happens when justice isn't just given, but witnessed? Rebecca Albright had spent years thinking she was untouchable. She had built her career on control, on the power that came with knowing she could dictate who belonged and who didn't. Now, she was being dragged out of the very place she had once ruled. The irony was suffocating. The two security officers who had once been her enforcers were now her escorts, leading her toward the exit of the aircraft like she was nothing more than an unruly passenger. The same passengers who had once laughed with her now refused to even look at her, because she was no longer a figure of authority. She was a cautionary tale. Her breath was shallow, her steps uneven. Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides, like she wanted to reach for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing left. She had no power anymore. She reached the doorway of the plane, her heart hammering as the realization sank in. This was it. The end. She turned, desperate, searching the cabin for one ally, one sympathetic face. Nothing. Only blank stares. Rebecca swallowed hard, stepping off the plane, her body numb. But the moment her foot touched the jet bridge, the flashes started. The cameras. She barely had time to register the sight of waiting journalists, of news crews already stationed outside the gate, before the questions started firing like gunshots. "Ms. Albright, do you have any response to the viral video? Why did you target Ayanna Sinclair? Are you aware that Sinclair Global has already filed a formal complaint against the airline?" Rebecca's mind spun. Viral video. She barely had time to process the words before she saw it. The screens. At the gate, at the airport kiosks, on people's phones. Her face, her voice, her words, captured in high definition. Her sneer, her arrogance, her demise. And beneath the video, millions of views. Rebecca stumbled. Her mouth opened, closed. Nothing came out. She turned to run to escape the nightmare, but there was nowhere left to go, because the world had already seen her, and it would never forget. 48 hours later, Rebecca Albright's name was now everywhere, not in the way she had once dreamed, not as a celebrated professional, not as a respected figure, but as a disgrace. The internet had eaten her alive. The video had spread across every platform, dissected and condemned by news anchors, activists, and everyday citizens. It had been played on loop on national television, on talk shows, even in political debates about systemic discrimination. And it wasn't just this incident that had surfaced, because people had dug. They had found her past complaints, the hidden grievances from passengers of color, the time she had been warned but never punished. She was no longer just Rebecca Albright. She was a symbol of everything wrong with the system. And the system had finally turned against her. 1 week later, Rebecca sat in the darkness of her apartment, staring at the blinking cursor on her screen. "We regret to inform you." The email was identical to the last 5 she had received. No one would hire her. Not just airlines. No corporate entity wanted her associated with them. Her name had become poison. And it wasn't just her career that was gone. Her friends had distanced themselves. Her landlord had sent her an eviction notice. Even the people who had laughed with her on that flight had unfollowed, untagged, and erased their connection to her. She was alone. Completely, utterly alone. At 35,000 feet, Ayanna Sinclair sat in seat 2A, the very seat she had been dragged from days ago. Only this time, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The flight attendant, not Rebecca, never Rebecca again, smiled warmly as she set a flute of champagne on the tray table. "Let us know if you need anything, Ms. Sinclair." Ayanna returned the smile, her fingers grazing the chilled glass. She looked around the cabin, at the same people who had once watched her suffer. None of them spoke to her now, because they knew. They knew they had been part of the problem, and she had nothing to say to them. Instead, she lifted the champagne, took a slow sip, and gazed out the window. As the plane ascended, leaving the ground far, far below, Rebecca Albright became just that. Something far, far below. A cautionare tale. A lesson learned too late. And Ayanna, she was above it all, exactly where she belonged. The end. What do you think? Did Rebecca get what was coming to her? Would you have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And let me know, where are you watching from? I want to see how far this story is reaching.